Hello, everyone, and welcome to McGill Cares webcast series supporting family and informal caregivers. I'm Claire Webster, a former caregiver, certified dementia care consultant, and founder of McGill University's dementia education program. I work with a dynamic team of leading healthcare professionals to run the program, who include Dr. José Moret from the Division of Geriatric Medicine and Dr. Serge Gauthier, Professor Emeritus, formerly the director of the McGill University Research Center for Studies in Aging. These webcasts are made possible thanks to the generosity of donors, and I would like to sincerely thank the Zeller Family Foundation for sponsoring today's webcast. So with the recent surge of cases in COVID, caregivers are once again finding themselves wondering whether residential care should be an option for their loved ones, and as well as the fact that they are worried about the people whose lives may be at stake or who are currently living in the long-term care fields. So I decided to invite Matt Del Vecchio today for a special additional episode of McGill Cares, who's going to help us navigate long-term care options. Matt has been a guest before McGill Cares. He's the owner of Lianas Senior Transition Support, which provides families with guidance and support in navigating home care and senior living communities. He is also the co-host of Life Unrehearsed on Montreal CJD 800 radio and is the seniors and aging columnist for the Suburban newspaper. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's so nice to have a role reversal. Instead of you interviewing me, I get to interview you today. So that's terrific.
I think I prefer the other way around, Claire.
Yeah, no, me too, I think. So in order to begin, why don't you give us more details about what a senior transition expert like yourself does?
Yeah, if you are in the process of navigating long-term care, seniors residences, the odds are it's the first time you're going through this, and it could be overwhelming, certainly emotional and stressful. Like, where do you begin? What questions do I even ask? And so our job is to help navigate all that. And another factor is time, Claire. It's especially for the sandwich generation, the adult daughters or sons that are busy professionals. They have their own businesses, they have their kids to worry about, and they're also concerned about mom and dad. And it's said that it's between 80 to 100 hours of time going through this process, from getting on the phone, doing Google Net searches, going on tours, talking to healthcare professionals to get evaluations and dossiers. It is a lot of time. And our job is to help guide, support, and save a lot of time. This is what we do every day.
So, because I know that we have viewers watching from out of province or maybe even watching from the US. So there are people like yourselves, I imagine, that are located across the country, maybe across the world even, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So specifically here, I would cover all of Greater Montreal and Laval, but we get demands for other parts of Quebec and other parts of Canada, and for that matter, in the States. So there are people similar to what we're doing in the rest of the province and the rest of the country, even in the US.
Okay, so the first question I really want to get into is, let's discuss the current situation with the pandemic, the impact that it's having on the long-term care residences. What is the situation and what have we learned over the past 2 years?
Yeah, so let's face it, Omicron is everywhere, and seniors residences are no exception. As a matter of fact, as of yesterday, the stats show about 65% of all of CHSLDs have at least one case of COVID. And about 1/3 of all retirement homes, these are RPAs, will have at least one case of COVID. So it's out there. But what's interesting is it's not making the news like it did back in the first wave. And a big part of that reason is because going back to November and December, every person in a senior's residence received their booster shot. That's making a huge difference for hospitalizations and even deaths. So if you look at the statistics, there's still hospitalizations and even deaths. If you look at 70 and above, the vast majority of hospitalizations and deaths are those coming from their own home as opposed to the residences. So it's almost been a bit of a role reversal. And I would want to add one more thing, Claire, and we've talked about this many, many times. Visitations are allowed still Now, there are some restrictions, how many people can show up, or how long they can be there for. But I think the government clearly realized after the first wave, that was a big mistake to shut the door down, not allow caregivers to go in. So we're very, very fortunate that they've recognized that caregivers can go in under some restrictions, but a lot better than what it was at the beginning.
So, I mean, I hear, we hear different stories in the news right now that in some residences, the healthy people are kept in their room and the unhealthy are walking around, or it's the reverse. I mean, do you have an idea of what is happening inside with regards to trying to control and manage the virus?
Yeah, things are getting better, but you are right. It reached a situation, as particularly those that were had dementia, wanderers, didn't understand the rules and regulations. They are going out in the hallways regardless. So a couple of residences, it's going to be short-lived, but a couple of residents reversed it. The healthy ones were in their rooms, and the people that were going to wander and go on, they were still going to do their thing. But that's not going to be a long-lasting. This was really, I think, a Band-Aid solution, and pros and cons to that.
Okay, so should people, family members now having to make this decision, should people be concerned about, moving a family member into a residence at this time?
Well, I think in general, you should be concerned about any transition. It's a big decision. So without a doubt, you still have to be prudent and do your homework. But what I can say versus the beginning of the pandemic, a couple things that are clear now. The quality of care is improving. There are more staff to resident ratios are improving. Another factor is what we call infection prevention and control, what's known as IPAC. That has drastically improved. When I would go to see seniors residences and long-term care homes pre-pandemic, they would have signage. Here's our pandemic protocol, which would usually be for the flu. And what it meant is they would slap a hand sanitizer station at the front entrance. Masks didn't exist. The hand sanitizing stations didn't exist in the hallway. So from an infection protection standpoint, things have really improved. However, we can't sugarcoat it. We have a long ways to go with our healthcare system in how we care for our elders. So that's why we love webcasts like this, Claire. We're bringing attention to it. We have to advocate more because we got a long ways to go still.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, and also in terms of how we provide training to the staff that are working in these facilities, because the staff deserve to be well trained, well compensated, and well looked after, right? I mean, that I think what the pandemic showed was that there was just a complete lack of training, especially with regards to caring for people with dementia.
Absolutely. It's a huge factor, Claire, lack of training. And actually maybe going through school and one day wanting to be in this field, so there has to start at the ground level, grassroots level to attract more people to this field.
All right. So now let's get into like the terminology, because, if we're talking about, let's say, if I look at the Canadian system and Quebec particularly, there's different terms. So we talk about CHSLD, we talk about the private versus the public. So there's different terms. Can you walk us through the differences between the types of residences and those terms?
We're a province of acronyms. There's so many different terms. It gets confusing. So I'm going to try to keep it nice and simple. Let's start at the basics. RPAs, this is Résidence Privée pour Aînés. This is what we would know as a retirement home, okay? There are no public RPAs. They're all private. And they'll range from the small home type where there's 6, 8, 10, 12 people, all the way up to the big residences with 400 or 500 people and everything in between, assisted living care and so on. The general rule of thumb is that if you are offering assisted living in an RPA, usually you can go up to a maximum of 3 hours of daily care. Help with bathing, maybe transferring from bed, even help with feeding, toileting, and so on. Once we exceed that threshold of 3 hours, then you start going out of the RPA category and moving into the long-term care category. So we've heard of CHSLDs, Centre d'Hébergement de Soins de Longue Durée, long-term care. So usually that is when you're no longer autonomous, you are more than 3 hours of daily care. So that's usually CHSLD. And there's one other little acronym called RI, Ressources Intermédiaires, that is also long-term care, but just a level below CHSLDs. The vast majority are CHSLDs, about 440 in Quebec, and there's a few other RIs.
All right, so now let's talk about that very complex process of how to get into the public long-term care CHSLD, because what I did not realize, and many people don't realize, is that in order to do so, you have to work with the CLSC. So how does that work?
Yes, so you're exactly right, Claire. It's a little surprise to some people, but yes, if you want to get into a public residence, and again, this could only be long-term care, there's not a public RPA, you need to approach your local CLSC. You have to request an evaluation for placement into a public residence. So that's the first step. And that's not an easy step because the CLSC, as you know very well, Claire, they are overloaded. So you need to request that evaluation and expect to wait. So you need to be persistent. Okay? Persistent, be polite, be respectful, but be persistent. It's okay if you call very often because guess what? Every other family is calling very often. Try to get that evaluation. Once you get that evaluation, they will evaluate your loved one, mom, dad, grandparent, whoever it is, to see if they will qualify for a public residence. And if they do, they will ask you, okay, which public residence would you like to go into? And they'll give you usually examples of which ones. And then you select that residence for a permanent bed. Great. But, and this is one of the gaping holes in our healthcare system, there are long waiting lists. So once you get to that stage of, yes, my mom or dad is on the waiting list, now you've got to wait. It could be anywhere from 1 to 2 years. We've had some families wait 3 years. It is very long. And so what happens in the interim is what they call transition beds. So a transition bed, you're still going to get the care, but that won't be your permanent bed. You get a choice of where your permanent bed is, but you don't get a choice of where that transition bed is. There's a whole triage system in place, first come, first serve, and that's where your loved one will go in a transition bed.
So a very important document that is also needed is that assessment from the doctor, because I have a lot of people writing to me and saying, you know, mom or dad hasn't been assessed yet, or my husband hasn't been assessed. Without that doctor giving that assessment, especially with regards to dementia, placement will be very difficult because they have to have that document. The CLSC has to have the assessment, right? And then a lot of people say, well, what's the point? If there's no cure with dementia, why should we get assessed? You need that assessment because you need that assessment not only to get placed, but you also need it to homologate a mandate, which means to be able to make the decision on behalf of your loved one to place them, correct?
Absolutely. And that assessment is important while you're going through that process. While it's hot, while it's being done, make sure you get a copy of the assessment, because if it gets to a point where you're trying to select between different residences, most likely the director of care, the head of nursing, will ask for the latest assessments. So if you have a power of attorney, request that assessment, keep it on file, and even ask for consent at the very time you're doing the evaluations. If you don't have a power of attorney, try to get consent so you can have a copy, because your loved one's not going to ask for copies. They won't know what to do. So you as the caregiver or whoever is responsible, ask for consent and grab that copy of the assessment. It will come in handy.
So once you make it on that waiting list, and you know, like Matt, you say, it's like could be a 2 to 3 year waiting list. But when you do finally get the call that there is a space, I mean, I remember having literally 12 hours to make the decision. So people must be saying 12 hours. Yes, I literally had 12 hours to make that decision. And if you don't take it, your name just goes back to the bottom of the waiting list again.
It's a real shock. It really is. And it's unnerving because you don't know when you're going to get that call. So you're always thinking about it because yes, 12 hours, maybe 24. The most I've seen is 36 hours. That's it. You've got to make that decision very, very quickly. Otherwise, you're back at the bottom of the list.
Okay, so now let's talk about the private system. You know, so why would some families choose to go into a private residence? You know, do they have waiting lists? And you know, can you give us an idea approximately with regards to cost compared to the public system?
Yeah, sure. Let's just begin with, okay, why do people go private? I think there are several reasons. The core reason is the family wants to do it because it's convenient, it's on their terms. They're choosing which residence and when mom or dad are going to go into that residence. That's the big reason why people are selecting private. And we have families that will go one of two ways. Some are just absolutely against the public system. They don't like the institutional look. Forget it. We're going private all the way to palliative care if we can. Mom and dad have worked hard their whole lives. They've been good. They put money aside for a rainy day. Guess what? It's a rainy day. Spend it on yourselves. We don't want your money. Take care of yourself. So that is one aspect we're seeing out there. The other reason is these transition beds. So know that there might be a 1 or a 2 year waiting list. So some families will go private during that transition period, because the transition bed, you don't have a choice where that is. It might be far geographically. It might, if you're Anglophone, it might be in a Francophone environment. That's very, very difficult. So some families will say, okay, you know what? I'll go private. I know it's not going to be forever. I know it's going to cost more, but I'll go during this transition stage. So those are the two main reasons. Now, are there waiting lists? There are some that have immediate availability. We are literally on the phone every week because it does change. What I can say though, if there is a waiting list in private, it is not like the public. We're talking 1 to 3 months. Okay, so it's not going to be a very long waiting list, and some do have availability. Regarding your question on cost, I get this all the time, and I wish I can give you a black and white answer, but I'm going to give you a bit of a gray answer, because it really depends on the amount of care and the type of residence you are looking for. So for example, I'm going to start with public in terms of cost. The 2022 rates just came out. It's $2,019.30 for a loved one in a permanent bed, private room in a public residence. Okay, so there's your baseline, $2,019.30. Now, if we move it up a little bit, RPAs. And the reason why I want to bring this up, some people think, geez, mom or dad, my loved one has dementia. They have to go into a long-term care home. That is not necessarily the case. You may have dementia, but physically you still may be okay. You may not need to be transferred out of bed. You might not even have a cane or a walker. Guess what? You won't even qualify for a public residence. So the RPA is there to pick up the slack if you want to go private. And they range from the smaller home type environments that I was talking about. In fact, they are becoming more and more popular. 8 to 15 people, usually a profile of someone who has some form of dementia. Physically, not so bad. They might need some help with getting dressed or wearing the appropriate clothes. They might need some help with some toileting. And they happen to be the least expensive. So a typical smaller RPA, 8 to 15 people, will run in the range of $3,500 to $4,500 per month. Okay, and you're getting all your meals, your heating, your electricity, your care. It's in there. The next step up would be an RPA assisted living. So you might see these beautiful retirement homes, mostly independent living, but some of them have care floors on them. So this is what we call RPA assisted living. They also offer good care, meals, and so on. And that pricing will be somewhere between the $4,500 to $6,000 per month. And then you have private CHSLDs, private long-term care. You could range anywhere from $5,000 all the way up to, Claire, you've seen $10,000 a month in some of these really high-end residences. I would say an average private long-term care is going to be around $6,500 to $7,000 per month. In the private sector, though, the provincial government will provide you with a monthly tax subsidy. It's about 10% of the average rent. So in long-term care, it would be about $750 that the province of Quebec literally deposits into the bank account. The government, in fact, this is one advantage in Quebec versus the rest of the country, have said there's no more room in the hospitals, there's no more room in the public residences, long waiting list, let's finance the private sector. So at least there's a little bit of money. It's a one-time application, $750 in these long-term care centers. It can go a long way and it will help out.
Yeah, and so many people are probably saying, well, why does it get so expensive as it goes on? But what unfortunately what we do know is that as the disease progresses, it goes from being very cognitively from very cognitive to a lot of physical dependence, right? And inevitably it becomes a 24-hour, 7-day a week, you know, um, management of this illness. So that's why, with the person will be completely dependent for their activities of daily living, dressing, bathing, feeding. So the more the care that's needed, the higher the cost of care.
That's exactly it. It's labor. I mentioned this $2,019 in public. Okay. Interesting note is that, well, it doesn't cost the government $2,019. It costs them a lot more. The average cost for one person in a public CHSLD is between $85,000 and $95,000 per year is what it costs the government. The taxpayer is paying about $24,000 of that. Okay, the person living there, but the balance of the taxpayers are paying the difference. So it is expensive because of a lot of labor and care involved.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the topic of guilt, right? The guilt of having to transition a loved one. I work with so many families, and it's obvious that everybody's intention is that they want their loved one to stay at home for as long as possible. I've even worked with families where the parents have literally threatened their son or daughter to say, if you ever place me, I'm going to take you out of my will or my inheritance. But unfortunately, as COVID has shown us, we need a plan A in life, but we need a plan B. What happens if the primary care partner, who's most of the time the spouse or the son or daughter, is no longer able to take care of that person? There's all kinds of guilt attached, right? Guilt, because we feel like nobody can take care of our mother, father, husband, wife more than we can. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, this is probably the toughest discussions we have, is this exact subject, because there is guilt. There's a tremendous amount of emotion involved. And so what I try to suggest is you need to break it down into parts. Okay. So you could look at things from a bit of an outside perspective to see if in fact it is the right time to make a transition. I break it down into 4 parts. First is safety and security. Mm-hmm. Is someone living on their own, or even with yourself or with a daughter or a son, is there safety and security? Is there a flight risk? Is there a chance that they're going to leave the oven on? Is there a chance they're going to leave the water running? And next thing you know, you have a flood. So if the safety and security is there, that's one aspect. Number 2, proper care. Are you able to provide the proper care? I get this a lot, particularly with spouses. Even, let's say, a woman trying to take care of her husband, and the husband has reached a stage where it's a one-person transfer, or the husband has fallen down and you just can't physically pick them up anymore. Bathing becomes difficult. Dressing becomes difficult. Are you able to offer that proper care? Are you able to deal with perhaps some aggression? Are you able to deal with dementia and the disease itself? It could be very, very tough, Claire, as you know full well. So that's second. Third, the caregiver and the support system. All right. This is probably the biggest one. You yourself as a caregiver, has it reached a point where you have become simply overwhelmed, physically and mentally exhausted? You just can't do it anymore. You can't do those baths. It is just too much. You need to look in the mirror and are you okay? Have you reached a point where even you're having issues with family now? You're having marital problems. God forbid, alcohol or substance abuse. Has that kicked in? You need to look at all these factors about yourself as a caregiver. And the last point to look at is finances. Let's face it, the pandemic started it's almost 2 years ago, Claire. And what we're seeing is, at the beginning, everyone's chipping in and helping out. And then life gets in the way. And you might have started with a little bit of CLSC help. You're not getting the hours from them. Now you're augmenting it with some private home care. Well, next thing you know, you're doing 5, 6, 7 days a week of private home care, and the finances, the cost is starting to add up. So you look at those 4: safety and security, proper care, caregiver health, and finances. And if you say to all four, we're good, great. Continue going at it. We know it's not easy, but you can still continue going home. If you look in the mirror and you can't honestly say yes to those, and those answers are no, then you are now sort of rationalizing that this might be the right decision. And that helps with the guilt part of it. Is it going to eliminate the guilt? No, there will be guilt. But if you could look at it pragmatically and rationally, breaking it down like that, I think you'll feel a little bit more at ease that this is the right decision.
I also think that, because I've had some of these conversations with people, I think it's also for the quality of life of that person, if they're at home and they're just sitting sometimes just all day in front of a television and they're not doing anything, they're not being stimulated. Oftentimes these residences can offer like tremendous social stimulation, leisure activities, and I know that they're trying to manage and navigate that with COVID, but sometimes you think, oh, they're better to stay home, but in fact, they're so isolated, right? I mean, what has COVID done, especially people with dementia? We've seen how it's made the disease progress, their symptoms progress, right? And you think, oh, they need to be home, but sometimes when they're in an environment where they're getting more stimulated, it could be even better for them.
That's a very good point, and sometimes overlooked. I often hear, no, they're not interested in activities. They're not going to participate in activities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just the fact, if they're able to sit in a chair and look, that is stimulation in itself. Even if they're not participating, that is a big factor. And you want to create that cognitive and, if possible, that physical stimulation. And you usually get more of that in some form of a retirement community.
All right. So now that the caregiver or family member has decided that, okay, they're going to do this, but now the conversation that they have to have with mom or dad who just doesn't want to transition, how do they manage that?
Yeah, that's another difficult one. And there's no cookie cutter answer. The way I like to do this, though, is at what stage of dementia is the situation, okay? So for example, if it's the beginning of the stage and you're able to rationalize a bit and you could talk, we always like to look for trigger events, because, by the way, there's going to be resistance. It happens even when there's no cognitive challenges. There's going to be resistance. So start with planting seeds. Look for some trigger events. A trigger event might have been a fall, might have been the oven being left on, bills not paid, a family member or a neighbor that's moved into senior living community that might have been experiencing the same thing as you. These are all important trigger events that we look for, but that could only take you up to a certain level. People of authority can be helpful. Very often we've seen the dynamics where the wife or the husband is the bad guy, or my daughter and son, they're just trying to put me out to pasture and they're trying to get rid of me. And you get these types of conversations. Sometimes people of authority will have a little bit more influence over the individual. That could be a doctor. It could be a social worker. They may listen a little bit more to them. I had one situation, believe it or not, it could be a family member. And in this case, it was a granddaughter, believe it or not. It was, I would say, early to medium stages of dementia. We were going on some tours, and the grandmother wanted nothing to do with their children's opinion. They are out to get her. But the granddaughter came along, who she adored. And the granddaughter did the tour with grandma. And the grandmother looked at her granddaughter, what do you think? She goes, Nana, this is unbelievable. Like, she didn't even know herself what would be involved. And in that very moment, she says, okay, let's do it. And we're kind of all looking at each other, but it goes to show, look for that person of authority. And even if it means that grandchild that will help out, might not be the ultimate decision maker, but look for those people of authority. And then the toughest one of all is because in Quebec, you are protected as a citizen. You make the final call on your own decisions. If you don't want to go, you're not going. You are protected by the government of Quebec. So if it's a situation where you are clearly incapacitated, the doctors have said it, you are completely dependent, then you'll have no choice but to go through that homologation process that you were talking about, Claire, where you are now taking decision-making powers away from the individual and now taking it into your hands.
Mm-hmm. I mean, everything that I had to do with my mom, from bringing her to that first doctor's appointment to having to place her, was against her will. She was not, I mean, she did not go voluntarily. And I finally had to take the decision that it was really with tough love. And it was because I loved her and cared for her so much, because I wanted to ensure that she was safe and provide the best quality of care. I knew that I had to do this decision. And the reality, for a lot of people listening is, as the disease progresses, the person is not able to think rationally and logically for themselves. Oftentimes they don't believe anything's wrong with them. They don't see what we see. So, trying to argue and rationalize doesn't work. And, there are those tough decisions that have to be made. So how do, in a lot of these residences, how does the staff, what can they do to help, or what do they do to help with the transition process? Because I know that, working with a lot of families, and we've worked together on some cases, the first, 2 weeks could be rough while the person really tries to get adjusted, but then they do. So how do the staff help out?
Yeah, a very good point. And maybe I'll even back it up a little bit as to what we should be looking for. Just don't assume the residence is good in memory care, okay? There are some beautiful residences out there, even have assisted living, but they may be only good on the physical aspect of things and not necessarily on the memory care, cognitive side of things. So, as you go through that selection process of the residence, make sure the staff understands memory care. Can they validate? Can they de-escalate? Can they redirect and distract? Are they used to that? Are there other people with dementia? So that's a very important part. If there's a wanderer, if your loved one is a risk at flight, then is it a coded unit? Once you choose that residence, this is probably where I see the most inconsistencies, is those first few days, the first few weeks, that month. And so it's quite important that you have discussions with intake, with the head nurse. What is the process? Who's going to greet my mom? What's involved? Is the personal care plan established? Do you have the list of medications ready to go on day one? Ask those questions. What happens, not if, when my mom is going to say, I want to go home? It's going to happen. How do you respond to those things? What about bathing? How do you deal with bathing? We all know bathing can be very, very challenging. Do you have staff that can handle the bathing? So ask these types of questions. And I think also, what is the visitation plan? And what I mean by that, and this is quite interesting, we have had some scenarios where they talk with the staff and the employees. Mom's very nervous and anxious. It might be a good idea for you to be here from the beginning, every day, check in, make sure this transition is smooth. That's how most happen. However, we'll call it the cold turkey transition, if you will. And believe it or not, this happens. And sometimes this may even be the best approach, not always, but have the discussion with the staff. Sometimes it may be better where you're there on the first day, make sure mom's all settled in. And then you're backing off for a couple of days, 5 days, a week, no contact. So mom gets adjusted much quicker to the staff. She doesn't have that out where I want my daughter. So sometimes that actually works. So we always recommend, because it's emotional, and if you're the caregiver going in, step back a little bit. And I've had some general managers and head of nursing saying, you know what? When the daughter or the son isn't here, mom is great. But when they get there, mom gets anxious and stressed. She feels the stress from the daughter and the son, and it's actually disruptive. So sometimes back up a little bit, and am I helping in a constructive way? I know it's difficult. It's easy for us to say that, but step back a little bit to make sure that you're contributing and not causing more of some issues.
That's an excellent point, because when I work with caregivers, that's, made the decision to place a husband, wife, mom or dad, and they still go every day to the residence. They stay for a couple of hours at a time, and they're still feeling exhausted and burnt out. It's because they haven't set any boundaries for themselves. I mean, the reason that they had to transition was because it was too much, but now they're still continuing that pattern of going every day for hours on end. So I always talk to them about, like you just said, set some boundaries. Maybe you go for every second day or every third day. And the other issue that comes up often is, depending on the residents, some of the nurses or staff are calling the caregiver 5 times a day to report every single like, I'm not talking about falls, but your mother's not listening, or your mother wants to talk to you, and I always say to them, you need to speak to the care coordinator and also the care coordinator and set boundaries as well. Say, look, I'm going to call my mom first thing in the morning, and I'm going to call them at the end of the day, but please, unless it's an emergency or unless it's something urgent, please don't call me constantly, especially for those people that are working. When you see that phone ring and it's the residents calling, I mean, it causes a lot of stress on the caregiver. I've been there. And so it's really about trying to set some boundaries, and so that the caregiver can give themselves permission to have some time for themselves.
Very good point. Yeah.
So, one of my I'd like to know, as we get close to the end now, if you have any final thoughts or advice. I mean, what I would like to say to people, though, is, a lot of people listening today may say, okay, this has been really good, but I'm not there yet. We're not there. We're really not there. But education is power, and you need to be one step ahead at all times. So even if you're not there now, do the work, get the information, understand what's needed, so that if you do need it suddenly or even in 2 years, you've already put all the pieces in place to get there. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Do your homework. Knowledge is power. Lack of knowledge usually creates anxiety. And I think if I were to add just one other thing, Claire, it's to expect the unexpected. Mm-hmm. No matter how organized you are, no matter how things are planned, things won't go as always as you want it to. Our radio show that we do is called Life Unrehearsed, because that's what it is. It's life unrehearsed. And I always find the caregivers that are the ones that are able to adapt, that understand that things aren't going to go as planned, and able to have that positive attitude. Those are the ones that really do the best.
Matt, how do people get in touch with you?
I think the easiest way would simply just, if you can go online and look up Lianas Senior Transition Support. Lianas is just an acronym, as you know, Claire, of my children's names, Lisa, Anthony, and Excel. So Lianas, Lianas Senior Transition Support. All my information's there.
And you can also write to us at dementia@mcgill.ca, and we'll pass on your messages to Matt as well. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to be on McGill Cares today.
Thank you, Claire.
So this webcast is an initiative of the McGill Dementia Education Program, which is funded by private donations. Once again, I would like to thank the Zeller Family Foundation for sponsoring today's webcast. If you'd like to have more information on our program, or if you would like to make a contribution, please visit us at mcgill.ca/dementia. And if you would like to register for our mailing list, and so that you know about upcoming webcasts and initiatives that we have, please email us at dementia@mcgill.ca. Thank you for watching.